Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's CollegeWise webinar. I am your host for this evening. My name is Anna, and today I'm being joined by Sam and Meredith, who are both former admissions officers, and we'll get to them in a little bit, and they'll be able to introduce themselves to all of you. But today we're going to be looking at highly selective college admissions. So I am going to kick us off by encouraging all of you in our audience today to start popping into our chat where you're interested in applying to. Of course, there are many colleges that are considered highly selective, so we'd love to know what schools are on your radar, what schools you're interested in applying to. So feel free to start popping that into our chat now. We have someone who said Brown, University of Michigan, Duke, Vanderbilt, amazing. Love to see that. So if we head over to the next slide, we are going to launch the first of two polls this evening. So I'm going to launch this one now, and you should see that pop up on your screen. I'd love for all of you to start answering some of the questions you see up there. This gives us a better chance of learning who's in our audience, how we can tailor some of our advice to all of you who is listening in as well. Lots of parents and guardians, lots of students as well. 11th graders, definitely those of you who are approaching application season soon. So you're definitely in the right place. Love to see that. So if we head over to the next slide, and I'll leave the poll up there for another minute or so. We do often have a lot of newcomers who are joining our webinar. So if this is your first CollegeWise webinar, welcome. We're so thrilled to have you, and we do hope that you join us for future events. But you may be curious what we do here. You know, who are these three people who are talking to you on this evening's webinar? So CollegeWise was established in 1999. And since then, we've worked with over 28,000 students and helped them navigate the college admissions process in a more simplified way. So our motto really is to help students experience a less stressful and more successful application process. And we do that through different ways and through very dedicated approaches. So we'll be able to talk through that a little bit later in the presentation. But as you can see up on the screen, we do have quite a few different stats, and we're always thrilled to be sharing some of those with families. But probably the most important that I like to highlight is our Trustpilot review. Now, I am the type of person that relies on reviews for everything, no matter how small or big the purchase is. It could be a $2, lipstick. I am looking at those reviews and making sure that I'm making a really good investment in whatever it may be. So I always encourage families to take a minute either during this webinar or sometime after and take a look at what some of our families are saying about us, and what, and how that advice might help you and your family make better decisions in the future. I also always encourage families to see what other families are saying about our competitors, and be able to compare and contrast those two to really help your decision-making process. Next slide, please. Amazing. So we've already had a question come through about a recording. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and those of you who have attended will be receiving the recording in the next 24 to 48 hours. We are also going to be conducting our live Q&A at the end of this session. So if you have questions for me or our two speakers, feel free to pop those into the Q&A tab at any point in the presentation, and we'll be able to get to those at the end. The one function we will not be using this evening is raise hand function. So if you do have a comment or concern that you'd like us to know about, feel free to pop those into our chat, and we'll be able to get to that as we move through the webinar as well. So with that, I am going to pass the mic over to our first speaker, Sam, and she'll be able to introduce herself to all of you this evening.
Thank you so much, Anna. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Justra. I am a college counselor here at CollegeWise. I live outside of Detroit in Michigan. I'm originally from Connecticut, and this is my third year as a counselor at CollegeWise. I came to this work from a career in college admissions for about 10 years. And I'm not going to read you through, my entire resume. You can see it on the screen a little bit. But you can see that I've worked at some pretty different institutions. So over that time, I had the experience of working at everything from small liberal arts college to private selective research university, and then eventually a big public flagship university here in Michigan. So I've gotten to see the process from many different angles. I've gotten to work with all different types of students from all over the world with different needs and interests and perspectives, and really got to see that process of helping a student find a school that's the best fit for them. I really felt that in order to be a college counselor, I had to know what the process was like on the admissions side. And I love being able to draw on that experience every single day in my work with students. There are so many options out there. It can be difficult and daunting, I think, to wade through it all and make sense of it and try to cut through the noise and separate fact from fiction. And that's one of the best parts of my job. So Meredith and I have done this presentation together many times, I think because of our shared experience working in highly selective admissions. But we're also, here to help students find the schools that are going to be the best matches for them, whatever they are. If you take nothing else away from my bio tonight, please, I hope that it is that I think I really am the world's biggest Jeni's ice cream fan. So if you're from Ohio and Meredith is, we talk about it often, you might be familiar with Jeni's. You can buy it anywhere. Sadly, there's no scoop shop in Michigan, which I'm kind of lobbying for. But if you want to talk about it after, I'm always open to that. It's probably my favorite thing in the world, outside of this job, of course. So I'm going to kick it over to Meredith now.
Well, thanks, Sam. I am based out of Columbus, Ohio, the home of Jeni's ice cream. So Sam and I really have bonded over that. And we don't let that little rivalry from the university she used to work at and the one that is just down the street from me get in the way of our work together. We never let that. So I'm Meredith Graham. You probably figured that part out. I just celebrated my 10th anniversary with CollegeWise. So I've been here just over a decade now, which is really cool. I spent about 15 years on the college side before joining CollegeWise. And most of my time was in admissions, but I did do a couple of pretty solid stints as an academic advisor and then a retention office as well. And my experiences in those offices are one of the big driving forces for me to be a college counselor now. One of the really amazing things when you are working in advising is you can see when a student has chosen a college that's a fantastic fit because you can watch them. It's like time-lapse photography, like the ones of the plants growing where you see them going from the seed into these amazing plants. You can see that happen when a student has made a good choice on a campus that's a fantastic fit. And you can also see when a student may not be a great fit with the school. You can see them either sort of doing okay, or the hard moments when a student maybe isn't at the right place or they're not there for the right reasons, whatever those are. And so those experiences really influenced my work as a counselor. And they also really sort of helped me be a better admissions officer as well. But those combination of experiences really helped drive me to do what I do today, and also to really want students to find places where they'll thrive, particularly when we're talking about highly selective admissions. And we're going to define what those colleges are here in just a minute as well. But particularly when we're talking about that, there are some really fantastic options in that cluster, and they are not for everyone. There are some students who really are far better served by attending another institution that's going to be a better fit for them where they can thrive. So, we don't want to sort of candy coat what we're going to be talking about today. I did see a couple questions pop in about, is this going to be for seniors as well? Yes, if you're a senior, you are still going to get information out of this today. Younger students may get a little bit more, but this is going to be helpful for everyone. The little note on mine there, I don't know whether or not there are any street parking members who are here. Street parking is an online gym, which I swear I never in a million years thought that I would do, but they have really fantastic programming and a really amazing community. If there are any street parkers here, feel free to consider this as street parking in the wild moment. Feel free to grab a screenshot at some point or a selfie, post it in the Facebook group if you want to do that. So, all right. So let's talk now about what what we're going to cover here. So we are going to talk about sort of the different components of highly selective admissions. We're going to talk about, admissions in general, but really focusing on highly selective admissions and how admissions to this small cluster of schools is really different. So we're going to talk about holistic admissions. What does that mean? We're going to talk a little bit about test scores, about activities, and the magic activity list. We're going to hit, the essays and talk a lot about sort of personal qualities and character all the way through here. I think let's get into the good stuff. Like, what are highly selective colleges? So highly selective colleges are the places that tend to reject more students than they admit. Sam and I were talking about this before, and the admissions threshold that we typically use and that CollegeWise typically uses is a college that consistently admits fewer than 20% of the applicants to that college. Because once you get below that 20% number, things start to get pretty unpredictable. It's a little bit wobbly in terms of like who's going to get in and who's not, because that means you have so many really fantastic applicants for so few seats that it's a lot harder to see from the outside who may or may not get in. I will also say that I have started talking with my families about highly selective programs also within universities. So if a particular program, and computer science in particular is sort of the blood sport of college admissions at this point, a lot of computer science programs are really far more selective even than their university where they're located. But there are all different kinds of highly selectives. A lot of times most people, will think about the Ivies to begin with. They all fall in that category, but it's not just the Ivies. We've got our military service academies. We've got places like Stanford and MIT, some of the public flagships as well. I think I saw, somebody in there talking about University of Virginia. That one's also on the list. Then there are also the liberal arts colleges, which sometimes fly under the radar in terms of fame and notoriety, but are just as selective in a lot of cases. And then there's some that sort of take people by surprise, depending on your sort of age and experience as a family. Northeastern sometimes takes people by surprise, and same with Boston University. The fact that both of those are in this below 20% threshold and well below 20% really is unexpected, I think, a lot of times for families.
And part of that, I think, too, there are many contributing factors to why we're seeing a lot of that selectivity increase or admit rates kind of fall, especially over the last few years, is that you can see from the slide this data showing that over time, and this is only representing the last few years, the number of applications that have been submitted has increased steadily. So about 15 million college applications across all platforms. So not just Common App, but across all platforms. Common App certainly gets the most attention as the largest, representing over 1,000 colleges and universities across the world. But despite that increase over time, one thing that really hasn't increased or changed much is the actual number of students who are submitting applications. So over time, students on average are applying to more colleges than they ever were. When I was in high school, I applied to 5 schools. And while that is typically the average, earlier this year, Common App released its kind of recent trend report, and the average number of applications that students were submitting had inched up from 4.8 to 5.0. We work with students who apply to 10, 15, 20, or even more schools. And so if you're applying to more schools, this is the extent of my math knowledge, then of course, colleges are getting inundated with applications, and at the most selective level, it's going to really drive down that admit rate. So it's a simple math equation, right? When we talk about selectivity and admit rates, it's a function of a math equation. But we'll talk about kind of the reasons for that, and also really uncovering what happens in that process when these incredibly difficult decisions are being made. And Meredith and I could host an entirely separate webinar just talking about how difficult it is at that level to make those decisions. And there are parts of this process that are in your control, and there are parts of it that are not in your control. And that is something that we help students work through and really put their best foot forward with the parts that they can control. This is an interesting slide to share too. I think it's a good kind of refocusing of perspective when you think about quote what it takes to get into one of these highly selective schools. So you can see that there are about almost 34,000 high schools across the country. That means there's at least one student who is the top of the class, 34,000 valedictorians across the country, let's say 34,000 class presidents. And so I would see this even in my time at Vanderbilt, and I would hear from students too, thinking like, oh, the student is top of their class. Like, of course they're going to get in, or the student, valedictorian or salutatorian. And they may be the very best student from that school, the highest performing, the most, the highest academic profile, what have you. But you can see that alone, and there's no single one factor anyway, that would get a student into or even out of the school, but that single factor alone is not enough to kind of hang your hat on and assume that you would get into any of these schools. You can see across the Ivy League institutions, there are just 14,500 spots. When we look at Harvard alone, that in first year incoming class is about 1,650. So there's no way to take every single student who's the first in their class. And mind you, this data also only represents within the United States. So think about internationally, all across the globe, the students that are in that applicant pool that you're kind of vying for a spot with. So I hope that this helps you to understand a big theme that we're going to talk about tonight, which is that there is no single factor that these schools, the highly selective institutions, even the big public schools that you might not think participate in holistic admissions. And there are so many factors that they're weighing and considering in conjunction with one another to make these decisions.
So
go
ahead.
Oh, I was just going to throw this quote up. I think that this is really illustrative of what we're saying. And I think it's important to hear it from the colleges themselves too, right? So this is directly from the University of Chicago website, an incredibly selective institution year over year. And I love that this is on the website because the school is telling you directly that there are so many factors that contribute to what would make you a great fit for this institution. Something that I like to tell students and often think about is if your admission to a school was based, or we're going to talk specifically about highly selectives, if your admission was based solely on your GPA and your test scores, Meredith and I wouldn't have had jobs, right? There would be no reason to have admission counselors because that information could be sorted in an Excel spreadsheet, right? Like there wouldn't be a reason to have humans reading these very human, very personal applications that you spend a lot of time and care on. And so there's so much more to you. And I hope that you feel this way about yourselves, but there's so much more to you than just the numbers or the data points. I would often get asked in admissions by students, what percentage does X weigh in your review process? Or what's the most important piece when an application is being reviewed? The first question is difficult, if not impossible to answer. You cannot, it's an art and a science, but you really cannot assign a specific percentage point. However, one thing that has always been true and will continue to be true is that the most important part, even in this holistic application review process, the most important factor is going to be your academic preparation. You are applying to an institution of higher learning. The school wants to know that you are prepared for the rigors that you're going to encounter once you get to that campus. They want to see that you've challenged themselves, or that students have challenged themselves. And for the highly selective schools, they really want to see that you're challenging yourself as much as you can within the context of what's available to you. I think, Meredith, you probably got this question a lot too, as I did at Vanderbilt and Michigan, was students would often ask me, like, is it better to get an A in a standard level class or a B in an AP class? And I see you kind of nodding because this is a familiar refrain for us. And I would tell students it's secret option C. For a lot of these highly selectives, they get to be the ones to say, you actually need to be getting the A in the AP class or the higher level class, whatever that is. And it's a little, pithy quip, but it's a way of saying these schools in particular expect to see that you are really challenging yourself to the maximum across the board, certainly in the areas that you're interested in, but really taking advantage of seeking out opportunities to challenge yourself in and out of the classroom. But that's really where it starts. Meredith, what else would you add?
Well, I think the one of the other really sort of a hidden, it's not really a hidden fact about highly selective admissions, and I know Sam would agree with this as well. When we talk, even within college-wise, with folks who have been admissions readers and officers at the highly selective colleges, and then when we talk with our former colleagues who are still at a lot of those colleges, when you're reviewing these applications, typically around 70 to 80% of the applicants actually do have the academic preparation and the rigor necessary to thrive on these campuses. There really aren't a ton of students who apply who aren't academically prepared. I mean, occasionally you'll see the student where, they threw in, sort of the Hail Mary where they've got all C's and they're like, I'm just going to take my shot. And that's totally fine. But like a student who has all C's in their high school, that's probably not somebody who's going to be competitive in these applicant pools. There are plenty of other colleges that will love that student, but these are not the colleges that will love that student. So when you've got 70 to 80% of this like massive application pool, that only winnows it down so much. And so then when you're trying to make these decisions, that's where the holistic piece comes into play. And that's also why I sort of joke with my students and my family sometimes, and I used to make this half joke as well when I was presenting in admissions. When people would ask a question, the most common response you're going to get from admissions officers is, it depends. And I think if you're not already annoyed by that response, you will be by the time you're done with this journey. But it's true. And that's the hard part. There's no one answer to most of these questions along the way. So now let's talk a little bit about what are the components that go into this holistic admissions. I think this next slide, we're talking a little bit about test scores. Now, test scores are in a bit of a weird hang at this moment. They were sort of decreasing in importance at many places, although not necessarily at the highly selectives. And then once the pandemic hit, and it was virtually impossible to get tests in the majority of the world, colleges, largely suspended their standardized testing requirements for that first year. And now most of the colleges, not all, are still doing some sort of like long-term pilot, or have made the decision, we're just going to do away with them completely. And that includes, some of the Ivies. It includes a lot of the highly selectives. Interestingly, some of them are saying we're doing a multi-year pilot study, and then we're going to decide whether or not we're going to bring them back. To me, the most interesting sort of back and forth right now is MIT and Caltech. MIT reinstated SAT requirements for this year's applicant pool. So if you're a senior this year and you're planning on applying to MIT, you are, again, required to submit SAT or ACT scores as a part of your application. And they said, when they do an analysis of their data, they feel that they have plenty of evidence on their campus that shows that that test gives them information that will help them decide and determine who really is going to be best equipped to thrive on their campus. They say that they have that information on their campus. Then you have Caltech, who has instituted a multi-year score-free pilot. So basically, Caltech, again, arguably the two top engineering schools in the US, Caltech has said, we have ample evidence on our campus that we don't actually need these test scores in order to determine who is going to be a great fit on our campus. And so we're engaging in a multi-year pilot to find out, and then we'll make a permanent decision at the end of this pilot. So when I say score free, they won't even consider your SAT scores if you send them. Don't bother. They're not even going to look at them. They're literally not a factor, not considering them at all. So you've got sort of this spectrum now. Generally speaking, if a college says their tests are optional, they do mean optional. However, I will say with these colleges, the caveat is you probably, especially if you're at a well-resourced high school, if you're at a place where students typically do standardized tests and they typically do pretty well at them, you probably need to lean into taking and doing well on the test and looking to submit them in most cases. One of the things that I'm least excited about, but I think that's generally sound advice that we give our students. Sam, what do you want to add to that? What did I forget?
No, you didn't forget anything. I would just underscore that these are really important and very personal conversations that Meredith and I and all of our colleagues have with our students, the decision of whether to test or not, and then also when. And we look at a lot of data points as we're deciding what to recommend to a student. And it's always a recommendation. The student always has the final say. But when you're looking at the middle 50% reporting data from a college or university of students who apply and students, even more than that, students who are admitted, generally, if you're scoring within the middle 50% range, then I would recommend you submit that score. But to be honest, for a lot of the highly selective schools, you really want to be closer to the upper end of that range. And it's part of being in this test optional landscape is being able to be strategic about this piece and maybe picking or choosing and kind of deciding how a test score may enhance or may not enhance your application. But one thing I do want to restate too is that test scores never have been, nor will they ever be the most important part of your application. They will never, especially at these highly selective institutions, a test score is not going to be the thing that gets you in. It could be the thing that keeps you out of consideration, but we've had years of experience. If neither of us has ever been in a committee room where the decision between two students who look the same on paper and nobody does, so that's a myth, it would ever come down to your test score, who has the highest test score, a 34 versus a 35. It just doesn't work like that. So it's one of those things that is a very personal decision for everyone to make for themselves, but that's a big thing that we work on with our students as well. All right, I am going to keep us moving to talk a little bit about extracurriculars. And I know that we had said in our agenda slide, this little line of the perfect activity list, hint, it doesn't exist. I think that there's an idea out there that there is like this magic formula or check box or checklist of items that you have to check off to be compelling to a university, or they're secretly looking to see that you have achieved this or have completed this. And the truth is, even though this might sound less helpful to you, is that there's really no perfect magic formula. And what one university is looking for from you is going to be very different than what they're looking for from this other applicant and this other applicant. If they were looking for the same thing from every single student, they wouldn't have nearly the diverse and as interesting campuses as they do. So they're really looking to assess, what do you do when you're not doing your homework? They're not making judgment calls on the types of things that you're involved in. Being class president is not better than being, key club president. There are not certain sports that are more impressive or anything like that. It's really looking at the fact that you have such limited time outside of your schoolwork, your classes, your homework. So whatever you're doing with that time, it must be important to you. At least that's our hope for you, right? That you're doing things that you genuinely enjoy, that you're growing and learning from, that excite you and kind of light you up. And so that how you spend your time is a reflection of your values and what's important to you, your curiosity, how you see the world, how you seek to impact your community, whether that's your immediate community, like your family, your school community, or even on a larger scale. We have a colleague who said this once a few years ago, and it's always stuck with me. And I don't know how relevant this reference is now, but if you imagine the Kool-Aid man from those commercials, the big giant Kool-Aid man who would like bust in the door and leave a giant Kool-Aid man sized hole in the wall. Like, think about that. What is your Kool-Aid man sized impact going to be on the activity or organization or group that you're a part of? So as you think about how you want to spend your time and what you want to involve yourself in, think about kind of the long-term, almost legacy, like something that will outlive you, because eventually you're going to go on to college. You're going to leave this high school community or other organization. But what is going to be your impact so that that continues and you can continue to kind of grow that involvement and that commitment? I often talk to students about taking things that they already like or that they're already doing and thinking about how they can scale that up or bring that to a broader audience. I hear from a lot of students that say, I know I have to have an internship, or I know I have to do research. And it's not true. I have a lot of students who do, absolutely, who do research with college professors or who have internships. But we have students who do all sorts of things. I have one student this year who's going to be a finance major, and her involvement with her temple is really important to her. And so we've talked about creative ways that you can kind of pursue business and organizational leadership outside of a traditional internship. And so she had this great idea this summer to work with her temple on Long Island and kind of coordinate with other local temples in the area to put together a fundraiser kind of art show to raise funds for the local community. And that's not a finance internship, but I can absolutely tell you that she exercises skills in organizational leadership and management and coordination and working with local partners, and gets to exercise those skills every single day. So you might have to use a little bit of creative and out of the box thinking. But that's one of the best parts, I think, about life and learning and eventually college, is seeing the different ways that you can make an impact and serve the people around you. And that's just one example of many I know that we have. But Meredith, what have I missed?
Yeah, I think sort of the idea of sort of the deep commitment and involvement, I think that's really, the students and families often do sort of think that the magic checklist exists and there's an expectation for a certain number or a certain combination of activities. And that really is not true. I've seen fantastic applications from students who had one activity on their application, and that was it. And I've also seen, students who had, the laundry list of activities where they were involved in every single thing, where they as students and applicants just weren't as compelling for various reasons. So there's again, it depends. You remember when I said you were going to be annoyed by that phrase? It depends. The thing that I encourage, and I know Sam and I have these conversations with our students a lot. Sometimes I'll get the question from a student, well, which one is going to look better? Should I do this or that? And what I always encourage my students to do is to think about, well, which one are you genuinely more interested in? I want you to stop trying to think about what it is the colleges are expecting from you. If you think back to that quote on holistic admissions from UChicago that was on an earlier slide, it actually even says that in the last little bit. You can go back and watch that on the replay or pause it and wind it back and grab that. But it actually talks about you doing the things that you're interested in rather than doing things that you think an admissions officer wants you to do. Ultimately, you are a more interesting and more compelling applicant if you lean into your own interests. And there are myriad reasons for that, including talking about, some of the things we're going to get to here in a few minutes. I'm not quite ready to talk about essays yet, but we will get to that. One other thing I like to talk to my students about, so say you're a ninth grader and you're trying a bunch of things, which we encourage too. You get to 10th grade and you realize you have like something that you really want to lean into, but you have too much on your plate. You're not sleeping enough. You're not, you're getting grumpy with your family. There is such a thing as a good quit. There is such a thing as walking away from an activity in order to make time for other things. And so students sometimes say, well, I have to keep all my activities because I have to show commitment. No, you don't have to keep every activity for your entire time in high school in order to show colleges you know how to commit to something. It's usually helpful if there are a couple of things that you have been able, or at least one that you've been able to deeply commit to over time. But it does not have to be every single thing. If you're not getting joy out of it anymore, if you're too tired, it's okay to walk away from something. And I think one other thing I want to sort of talk about too, a lot of what goes into the activities, and a lot of what ends up sort of showing up from this is around students' character and sort of who you are and what you like, again, how you care about other people, how you engage with other people in the community, in addition to the Kool-Aid, Mr. Kool-Aid size hole in the wall. And one thing that I like to talk about, I work with a lot of students who are interested in STEM, and a lot of them are on the more introverted side. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And I think there can be sort of this common misconception that in order to have a valid activity or have it be meaningful or have it be, noteworthy to admissions officers, that you have to be a president or you have to found a club. And you know what? For some students, that's really can be helpful, especially when you think about, I created this club. How will it live on after I graduate? That's key. Don't just found a club and then walk away. But you also don't, and I spend a lot of time talking with my students about creating plans if they do want to found a club, that actually we actually spend time creating a plan so that they have something that will endure and isn't just something they did for their applications. But, for somebody who's a little bit more introverted, a little bit more reserved, if being at the front and center is not your natural thing, it encouraged you to maybe sort of lean into a little bit of a challenge. But if that still isn't your thing, guess what? You can still lead. You can still make an impact, even if you are reserved, even if you are an introvert. There's still plenty of ways to get involved in meaningful ways that will be noteworthy to admissions officers, even if you don't have the title of president or the title of club founder next to some activity you're involved with. I promise you, there are still ways for you to do that. All right, I think I'm done talking about activities now. So let's get on to the next fun piece, which are essays. So, for the majority of holistic college admissions, essays matter. How much they matter, which essays matter, it can vary a little bit. But especially for these colleges, the essays matter substantially, particularly, I would say, the supplemental essays. So, for a college that's on the Common App, which again, there are more than 1,000 colleges on the Common App, and I'm sort of a Common App super fan, so I love it. They're sort of the central personal statement. So a lot of times when students are talking about, I have to write my college essay, that's sort of the old school thought, is this common personal statement. But then each college is going to ask their own supplemental questions, or at least most of them do. Not everybody does, but most of them ask some kind of questions. And those supplemental questions are really, 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 really important to these colleges. Yes, I'm overemphasizing that, but those are places where you need to really be able to show them that you've done your homework about them as a college, and also that you understand yourself well enough. Like the self-awareness piece, I think that's also a big thing I talk with my students about, is knowing yourself well enough, because the key to really talking to a college about why you think they're a great fit for you is understanding yourself and who you are. You can't really tell college why you're a great fit on their campus if you don't understand what you're looking for in a college, if you don't understand where you as a student are going to thrive. And so really sort of thinking about that element, really leaning into that and understanding yourself before you try and write an essay about, like, why is Brown's open curriculum such a fantastic opportunity for you? Well, for some students, the open curriculum at Brown is terrifying. For a lot of students, it can be really great, but it's sort of an intellectual adventure. Before you can really write that essay in a compelling way, you need to understand what kind of intellectual adventures you are interested in, and then connect it to what Brown has on their campus. And that goes for every one of the different supplemental essays, whether it's why are you interested in the major that we offer on our campus? I mean, we didn't really talk about Georgia Tech yet, but like they used to have an essay, and I loved this prompt. I'm sorry they did away with it, but they used to have an essay prompt that said, other than athletics, location, and prestige, why are you applying to Georgia Tech? So they literally were saying, don't talk about those three things. You have to give us something else. And so, students who knew themselves and had done their homework were able to talk specifically about, at Georgia Tech and their engineering program and their computer science program, they've got these cool threads in their academics. And so we're able to sort of talk about those kinds of things. And I'm interested in this area, and I see it reflected in the curriculum here. Sam, what else am I missing?
I was just going to say that these supplemental essay questions are a reflection of the school's values. They are telling you what's important to them. And so an example that we often like to give is the University of Chicago, speaking of UChicago, who is known for having very quirky, off the beaten path essay questions. And if I have a student who's interested in UChicago, even if it's early on in the process, we'll go immediately to look at the supplemental or past supplemental essay questions. And often students are either drawn to them immediately or kind of like, ooh, I don't know, this is weird. I don't know if I could ever answer this question. And that can be an interesting litmus test to get a sense of if you're going to be a good fit for the school. Like these questions are meant to be difficult. Like you should be thoughtful and you should grapple with them. But if you encounter questions and you're like, ugh, that's not for me, then I think it's worth listening to that voice and kind of assessing, is this campus community, college, that espouses these values, is this going to be a good fit for me? We are deep in the thick of supplemental essay writing and drafting right now with our students, and it's such an important part of the process. And I really love, Meredith, what you said about kind of first you have to know yourself before you can really connect that to why you're interested in any given school.
And can I say one more thing before we go to the next slide? The other element, and one of our other colleagues talks about this a lot, like the essays, the content is important. I also want to emphasize, like, when you're writing these, there is a point where you have to say, this is good enough. If you spend, if you're not familiar with the law of diminishing returns, the idea that if you spend infinite time on it, it will continue to get infinitely better. That's not true. Even with these essays, like, you need to get them to a certain point where, like, you've put in the time, you've put in the effort, you've put in the thoughtfulness. But if you find that you're doing repeated drafts and iterations of 5-word phrases, or you've written 14 different drafts of a personal statement and you can't decide which one's better, you probably need to set it aside and walk away for a little while and come back again, because you're at a point now where the work you're putting in, you're not getting enough back out of that work. And it can also be hard for students who are applying to these colleges, because you're so used to, I actually wrote a blog post for CollegeWise a couple of years ago called The Perfect College Essay. I think that was what the title was, but basically talking about, you need to find a time where you need to be able to sort of step away, because you sort of can get into like a doom spiral of editing if you're not careful. So sorry about that, Sam. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I think that's a really important point. So thank you. And what I want to talk about now really briefly is something that hopefully you've noticed has been woven into our conversation throughout tonight, which is this idea of personal qualities and characteristics, the intangibles, the qualitative pieces of your application. So when you're applying to these highly selective schools, and many colleges out there, not just highly selectives, you are often applying to residential communities, meaning students, whether that's some or the majority, or in some cases, all students live on campus. So not only are you applying as a student in the classroom or in the lab, but you are applying as a community member. So colleges are looking for different kind of clues throughout your application that will shed light on the type of community member you're going to be. What kind of friend are you going to be? What kind of roommate are you going to be? These factors have always been important in the college process. I think, to be honest, over the last few years, they've come even more to the forefront as we're looking to create really intentional, inclusive campus environments where all students can feel supported and safe and challenged within that space to push back, but to also be comfortable and be themselves and to grow and stretch and to learn in all these different ways. That's one of the best parts of college, no matter where you go. If you're not in an environment that lets you or pushes you to do that, then I don't really know what college is for, to be honest. But there are a lot of different places in your application where colleges can get insight into these kind of personal aspects. They can really manifest themselves in so many different ways. Like we were talking about earlier with your activities, how you spend your time is a reflection of what's important to you and what your values are and how you serve others. Even in your transcript, you might not think about this, but the classes that you choose to take throughout high school is a representation of how you challenge yourself and how you follow that intellectual spark and curiosity, and how you continue to explore within the confines of what's available to you in your school, whether that's enrolling in a dual enrollment course in math because you've exhausted your math curriculum, or I have a student who's going to be taking Arabic, like a higher level Arabic class through Harvard Extension this year because she's maxed out her French curriculum. And this is a language she's always wanted to learn. So that is a great way for colleges to get a sense of how you're going to maximize your opportunities on campus. Another thing that I always love to do with my students is pull up the teacher recommendation form on Common App, which they've likely never seen before. Why would they? And won't see from their own teachers. But I like to show that if you're not familiar with it, and you can pull it up, you can Google it easily, this chart of all the different kind of dimensions that a student will be assessed on from their teacher. So of course you think automatically academic achievement. Yes, absolutely. How you perform in the class is a part of it, but it's not everything. Sometimes students are surprised to see that their teachers are going to be evaluating them on things like reaction to setbacks, or maturity, or integrity. So it's important to think about that as you think about how you move about the world, how you treat others. Are you kind, inclusive? How do you act and behave when no one's watching? Are you the type of person to notice someone sitting by themselves in the lunchroom and invite them to your table? Are you someone who doesn't need to be told to step up or pitch in when someone needs something? Do you kind of look around you for holes in your community and fill them without being asked? those types of qualities of initiative, leadership, inclusiveness, compassion, collaboration are all incredibly important as schools. Just as you're trying to find a school that's going to be the best fit for you, the school is trying to see how you're going to fit into their community as well. Meredith, anything I missed there?
I think with this, you know, the personal qualities, I'm in the middle of another project with one of our other counseling colleagues. CollegeWise created this thing called the Thought Leadership Council this year, and I'm one of the counselors who's on it. And I'm literally in the middle of a data project around sort of personal qualities and admissions and how colleges talk about those personal qualities and admissions, like what they say publicly about them. And when you dig into the data that's available, this is the number one most important non-academic factor in admissions is who the student is. And, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, the number of students who are applying, the volume of students who are applying to these colleges. And you saw sort of those kind of shocking bar graphs earlier about, you know, the number of students and the number of actual seats that there are. One of the things that goes on at most of these highly selective colleges is you have these things called admissions committees. And so once you get through, you know, however many applications that you actually can say no to, which again is an incredibly difficult job. I mean, honestly, that's one of the reasons why I prefer this side of the desk. I prefer doing this job because it's much easier to easier. I don't want to say it's easy, but like cheerleading is a much more natural resting state for me anyway. But when you're in committee, when you've got, you know, 10 applications and you're trying to sort of talk through and you as the person who's responsible for shepherding those applications through, it may be that you're in charge of that high school or that particular territory or however your admissions office divides them up. If I'm the one who's in charge of advocating for and helping sort of shepherd the applications through, if I can tell from the letters of recommendation, from the activities, from the students' essays, from all of those pieces that this is somebody who is a nice person, it's somebody that, you know, I, you know, would say like, I'd be cool, you know, if my nephew were roommates with this guy, you know, I would be fine with that. Like, I know that I'm not going to get a professor coming and saying like, we got this real jerk in our class. If a student is coming across at school, like they're a jerk and their letters of recommendation are like, this is a brilliant student, but he's just not very nice. He's rude to teachers. He's disrespectful. I have a really hard time fighting for that student in committee. It's really easy to say no to that student in that moment. So again, like cultivating those natural elements. And I also would argue that, you know, personal qualities and characteristics, like being kind and compassionate, caring about other people, that's also kind of a good life skill, good social, like societal skill as well. Yeah, so I think that's everything for this one. So now we need to talk about sort of one of the cold statistical realities of highly selective admissions. And that's this idea of early decision. I think early decision, for folks who aren't yet familiar with all the lingo and terminology, early decision is an admissions application program that certain colleges, not all colleges, offer, where a student basically says, if you accept me through this program, it's an earlier deadline. Usually it's in early November. Sometimes there are multiple rounds, but it's usually in early November. And the student says, you know what, I'm promising that if you say yes to me, I'm promising you I will withdraw every other application to every other college and I'm coming to you. I'm making you that promise. And so it's kind of a big deal. And students have to promise that on their application. On the Common App, there's actually a piece that the school counselor needs to sign off on, and the parents have to sign off on it as well, because it is a big commitment. And so then if the student's admitted, the expectation is that student is going to withdraw all of their other applications and come in. Now, for a student, that's the best way. If a college offers early decision, that's truly the best way you can demonstrate interest in that college. But the other piece of this is that when you're looking at the numbers on here, the admit rate is different, early decision versus regular decision. So you see Northwestern, Vanderbilt, Brown, and then you see the ED versus the RD admit rate. And this is all publicly available data. It's, you know, available in a number of different places. So the admit rate varies dramatically. So if you love Northwestern, if you know it's your top choice and your family can figure out the finances, you're willing and able to make the finances work at Northwestern no matter what, then early decision is a really smart strategic choice to consider. And the number of conversations that I have with my students, and I know Sam, the same for you, like around this, because it makes a difference when you're trying to sort of navigate this entire journey. And the other thing, if you see that last column over there, that percentage of class filled in early decision, that means that if you're applying in regular decision, you have at Northwestern, you had less than half of the seats available that you were vying for, which is why that regular decision admit rate is so much lower. Now, there are places also that do, some of the Ivies and some of the other highly selective colleges do this thing that's often called restrictive early action, sometimes single choice early action, which is another program, usually also with early deadlines as well, deadlines in early November. But it's non-binding, but they restrict who else you can apply to at the same time. So it's sort of like you can only apply here early unless it fits one of these other criteria. So like a lot of times public colleges are exempt from that, but not always. So you have to read the fine print. There's not a lot of good data on what the difference in admit rate is from the restrictive early action versus the regular decision. Generally speaking, we know that the rates are a little bit higher, but there's not quite as much leverage in that for students and families, because you're not bound. Like, yay, it's not a binding thing, but if you're applying early to Stanford and you get in, chances are good you're pretty interested in Stanford. So yeah, this is definitely one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about.
And like Meredith said, applying early decision to a school is the biggest demonstration of an interest that you can get. And by the time you get to fall of senior year, it's the last tool in your toolkit that you have that has the potential to exert any type of influence over your decision. And that's why we have multiple conversations with our students, I would say anywhere from the end of junior year through October in some cases, of really weighing all the different perspectives of if early decision is going to be the right decision for you and how to be strategic about it. But speaking of demonstrated interest, this is a really important slide to share, I think, for a couple of different reasons. So what you're looking at is information from the NACAC Admission Trends Survey, which is the national organization that college admissions officers and school and independent college counselors are kind of part of, kind of governs us and our work. And this is the most recent data that we have that they've released. And you can see that in all these different factors that are considered, fact checking us that yes, your transcript is the most important part of your application, but demonstrated interest right here, about 70% of schools across the country, the world, care about demonstrated interest to some extent. I think it is an absolutely appropriate question to ask a school if they consider demonstrated interest in their process. A lot of them will be really upfront with you and they'll tell you if it is a factor. I was actually just on a webinar yesterday for Tulane, which is pretty notoriously big on demonstrated interest. And I walked away feeling like, okay, you don't have to go visit campus, but you better be opening their emails and clicking through their links, because that's something that they will consider in tandem with all of those other factors. But one thing that is important to note for highly selective schools that might be counterintuitive is that the most highly selective schools are, in a lot of cases, the least likely to care about or to track demonstrated interest. When I was at Vanderbilt, we talked about how we really wanted to try to level the playing field. Not every student has the same educational capital or ability to hop on a plane to visit Nashville or knows about alumni interviews. And so we assume that if you're applying to us, you must be interested. So in a lot of these cases, if you can visit a college, if it'll help you make a decision, absolutely do it. If you have a question and want to reach out to an admission officer, that's what they're there for. That's what Meredith and I did for many years. And I don't think we're that scary. There's an actual person on the other end of this process. Feel free to send them an email. But for a lot of those highly selective schools, that's not going to make a difference in the admission process. If you do it, great. But if you don't, it's not going to hurt you. I know that was a lot of information to kind of digest. I am going to kick it back to Anna to wrap us up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam and Meredith. Again, we've been talking a lot about highly selective colleges. We've seen many comments and questions come through, but now we're going to shift our focus a little bit to college-wise. Again, we're talking about these colleges who are frankly, they just have very few seats for students, right? Sam had talked about it earlier. You can have an X number of valedictorians, but unfortunately, Harvard only has a certain number of spots. And these students, no matter how amazing they are, there's just not enough room for them. So when it comes to working with CollegeWise, one of the things that we love to promote to families is finding that best fit college. Now, that might be a highly selective school, but it might not be a highly selective school. And that's why working with experts like Sam and Meredith and some of our other college counselors gets really helpful, because we can come in and really determine which school is the best for you. But because we are talking about highly selectives, up on the screen, I do have some really incredible stats of the admissions rates that we've been seeing at CollegeWise. That graph that Sam had showed earlier of how high the application number has grown since 2019 to 2022. Well, up on the screen, we do have our CollegeWise admit rate for those very years. So even when we were seeing such a competitive cycle, CollegeWise was still doing really well in helping students gain admission to these very colleges. So you can see the general admit rate at Harvard has been about 3%, whereas working with CollegeWise has led to a 14% admit rate. So we always like to remind families that they do not have to go through this process alone. And if you do want to work with CollegeWise, we're always here to help you as well. And if we move to the next slide. Amazing. So for those of you who might be interested in getting some last minute support, or you're looking for some long-term help with the college application building process, one of the first things that we love to do with our students is that application strategy. As you probably heard from Sam and Meredith today, a lot of things need to be taken into consideration when students apply. There is no one thing that is going to help a student gain admission to college. There's no such thing, right? So working with students and being dedicated to building each application component really makes a big difference for these students when it comes to actually applying and clicking that submit button. Essays are a huge component of the application. Depending on how many colleges a student applies to, they might be writing upwards of a dozen college essays, right? The personal statement and supplementals. So having a team that can really come in and help refine and polish those essays, Meredith and Sam are nodding. They absolutely know what we're talking about here. But having a team that can come in and help polish those essays can help students feel a little bit more confident about what they are submitting. And we at CollegeWise actually have an in-house essay review team that goes through each individual essay and offers insight there as well. We always like to remind families, you work so hard, students work incredibly hard during school. So having us experts come in and help project manage this process makes a world of a difference to students. Letting us come in and take off some of that heavy lift from the students' shoulders. All we hear from families after we're done with the process is a huge thank you, just by making it a little bit more simpler. And then finally, for SAT, ACT, and AP, we do have an in-house tutoring and test prep team that works very closely with students to help them navigate those as well. And if we move on to the next slide, I am going to launch our final poll for this evening. And we would love to ask all of you what you're interested in. How can CollegeWise best help your family? Up on the screen, we do have a few different options. If you're interested in learning more about how you can get in touch with us for some long-term support, we're happy to help you. Or if you're a senior who's really feeling the pressure, we have some support that we can provide you with as well. And then, of course, some of our complimentary resources, which we're always happy to share with all of you, in addition to the recording that we will be distributing in the next 24 hours as well. So I'm going to leave that poll up there for a minute. Feel free to start answering some of those questions up there. Now let's move into the Q&A, because we do have only a few more minutes left. We had one great question come in from Sherry, and Meredith, I'm going to send this over to you. How does the admissions process look at some of these larger colleges? Does it begin with a regional admissions officer, or is it more of a objective process?
So I'm going to start with our favorite phrase, it depends. Woo! And again, the most common model at most colleges is to have like a regional representative or a regional team and sort of filter reading through that regional team and pipeline. And one of the really important bonuses of that is, as a regional representative, you get to know the area really well. You get to know sort of the nuances of, you know, whatever is unique about public and private education in different areas, different geographies. There are some larger universities that do a bit of data entry to begin with. So they have somebody basically like taking the transcript and entering it in to make it easier for their readers. So that does happen at some places. But for places that do holistic admission, there's generally not like oh, you didn't hit this minimum threshold, we're not even going to look at your application. I think that's sometimes the question behind the question.
Yeah, absolutely. We also had a question come through about how to interpret the common data set. So Sam, I'm going to pass this over to you. If the common data set is reporting 55% SAT, 39% ACT, does this mean that 94% of all the students that are being admitted have submitted scores? How should that be interpreted?
It's a really smart, insightful question. I didn't know what the common data set was until I started working in admissions, but if it's something that you have heard of, or maybe you've been poking around college websites, it's pretty easy to find. This is public data that universities release with everything related to financial aid, to the number of applicants, the middle. This is often where I go to get the most up-to-date current information about test scores and schools are reporting out. These numbers look very different over the last few years than they did prior because of this acceleration in the test optional movement. But what I always tell students is that there's really, first of all, there's no preference between the SAT or ACT. I mean, truly, even for these schools that we've been talking about, they do not care. It does not matter. I think that what's interesting is that we also rely to some extent on data of college-wise students that we've worked with in the past. So we analyze admission trends of our own students over the years, and we can see when when a college says that they don't care if you submit test scores. We can also dig into our own data and look at patterns and say, well, that's what they're saying, but at least in our experience, most of the students who are being admitted are submitting test scores, or it really doesn't seem to be a difference at all. So when you're looking at that data, I think it's so difficult to kind of pin everything on it because there's so much more to those applications than just the test score. And like I said, it's not the most important part of the process. And I know that doesn't directly answer the question, but I think especially when you're talking about the testing piece, it's so nuanced. And there are so many questions that I think you have to answer for yourself to know if that's going to be the right move for you.
Yeah, and I think it's very helpful. Thank you, Sam. Before we move on to different application components, we did have another SAT, ACT related question. Meredith, I'll pop this over to you. Does it hurt to submit an ACT score that might be less than what is considered average online for these highly selective schools? In this case, this individual is saying a 34 ACT.
So does it hurt? That's one where, and again, this is like, I will say that's been the most time consuming conversation over the last 3 years in working with our students, is going through with each of my students. I talk about, will this score at this college be a net positive, a net neutral, or a net negative? I do that with every single student, with every single school. And so that's really, I think, the question that this person is trying to dig into. Generally speaking, when colleges talk about the middle 50% of test scores for admitted students, that's like, the score, if 25% of students who are admitted have above that score, the majority, like the middle half of test scores for admitted students are in this range. And then 25% of students were admitted who were below that score, just in case folks don't know what the middle 50% is. So if the student's saying like, my ACT of 34 is below the middle 50% of this school, without knowing the student, without knowing the situation, my gut says it's a little lower. If it were a 32, I would say that probably would work against you at one of the highly selectives. A 34, that's one where I would have a really in-depth conversation with my student, because there's also some skew to the numbers now because students are less likely to submit their scores unless they are really confident that they're great scores. And objectively, a 34 is a fantastic score. It's only in this weird world of highly selective admissions that makes everybody really just feel like you're not doing enough no matter what you do, that this is a conversation. Objectively, a 34 is a fantastic score.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to just make a quick note. A lot of these questions that we're receiving are very specific to the student. So that's really where having that next conversation with CollegeWise is helpful, because then we can dig a little bit deeper and see your overall profile and add some context to some of the questions that we're receiving. So we're going to flip it over to more general questions. Sam, we often get students and their, or parents and guardians writing in saying, does an A in this course look better than a B in this course? What are your thoughts to that?
One of my favorite myths to kind of dispel is, this is going to sound weird, like the importance of your GPA. Obviously, your GPA is important. How you do in school is important. But I think sometimes students may place like an outsize, might like assign it an outsized weight. And what I mean by that is, students are applying to colleges and universities from all over the world in all different types of high school settings with all different types of grading scales and curricula and resources that are available to them. So a 4.0 from one school could mean something very different than a 4.0 at another school. Students, just in the same way that you probably know a 4.0 in one of your classes could mean something very different than getting, an A in another class. And so what matters so much more than just the number is the story behind the number. And that's why we talk so much about challenging yourself and rigor within the context of your school environment. Because yes, I think like if you're getting straight A's in the standard level curriculum versus getting A's in an honors or AP or higher level curriculum, like, yes, for these very selective schools, like I said earlier, they want to see that you're really challenging yourself to the nth degree across the board. But it's really kind of how you got there and how you chose to challenge yourself that is going to matter more than just the number. And we talk so much about context for that reason. Students, you are never going to be compared to a student from another high school. There's just no way to do that because you don't have the same opportunities and resources and requirements. And so, if your high school doesn't offer AP classes, for example, will you be penalized for not taking them? No. However, I think there is something to be said for, and I mentioned this earlier, if and when you've maximized the curriculum within your high school, kind of that intellectual spark of going beyond those confines and finding ways to keep challenging yourself and keep exploring, that reveals a lot of that intellectual curiosity too. But that's a long way of saying how you get to that GPA is more important than just the number itself.
Yeah, absolutely. We are over time, so I am going to ask one final question. Meredith, we always talk at CollegeWise about demonstrating leadership has nothing to do with the position. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? We've had quite a few questions come through about when, is it too late to get started? How might someone be able to demonstrate leadership? I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of different ways to demonstrate leadership that don't involve being a president or founder of an organization. There's always the opportunity of doing your own thing. I had a student a couple of years ago who was working just a job at his family's church because it was, just working some reception hours, and the folks at the church needed somebody to convert their newsletter from paper to online. And they were talking about how frustrating it was because most of the folks on the committee were older and they didn't know the technology well enough. And so he was like, this is something I'm really good at. Like, I'd be happy to do this for you. And they were thrilled. That's an example of leadership. He saw a need and he stepped into it. I'm working with another student right now. And this is one of my seniors. And I just love that she did this. She was trying to figure out a way to serve her community. And we talked a lot early on about like, what needs do you see? Like, how do you want to volunteer? What needs do you see in your community that need to be filled? And so she worked with a local food bank, and then she worked with the local YMCA, and she ended up creating something kind of like a little free library, but for hygiene products at the local YMCA. And it's a permanent installation outside the Y. She's fundraised for it. She's gotten donations for it. It's going to be sustaining for probably another 5 years at least, even if she doesn't do another thing. And so that is also a way of leading in her community that doesn't involve being a part of a club or an organization at all. So like there are ways, even as a part of a club, there's another counselor who worked with a student who was on, I think it was his water polo team. It was a sports team at his school, and he was terrible at it. Like terrible. I mean, he was on the team, but he was like the last string, like the last person ever to get in the water. And the coach said, we're going to be doing a fundraiser. And this student was like, I'll be in charge of the fundraiser, because, they were doing a fundraiser for like new, like jackets for sitting on the side. And he's like, I'm the one who's in the jacket the most. I have a vested interest in making sure we have enough money for this. So he ran, like he was the student in charge of the fundraiser. He wasn't the captain. He wasn't, and he actually got the coach's award for leadership on that team that year because he had raised his hand and said, this is a way that I can help the team. So those are just a couple of different examples of leadership that don't involve founding a club or being in charge of an organization or being a president or being a captain of anything. There are lots of others too. Those are some of the most fun conversations, I think, for me, are finding ways for students to, to lead in ways that don't involve having a title.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave us off by saying every admissions journey is unique. Every student is unique. And we do wish all of you the best of luck in your journey. We want to thank you for joining us. Sam, Meredith, I want to thank you as well for giving this incredible presentation and helping these students navigate the highly selective admissions process. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you soon in our future webinars. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.